Hello, bonjour à tous. My name is Lise Brun. I'm a program officer with the Canadian Association of Research Libraries, CARL. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion, Institutional Perspectives on Investments in Open Infrastructure, which has been organized by CARL in collaboration with the Canadian Research Knowledge Network and SPARC. Before we get started, I wish to acknowledge the centrality of the Indigenous land on which many of us are living and working. I am grateful to live and work in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I recognize that this territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, first signed in 1726. We are all treaty people, and we are indebted to this land and to the Indigenous peoples who hold a deep belief in the respect and protection of this land. I'd also like to acknowledge that the speakers today, many of the speakers are joining us from traditional territories of a variety of Indigenous peoples. I invite you to add your own land acknowledgements into the chat. Please note that this session has simultaneous interpretation. So if you have not used this before, if you wish to hear the presentations in the language of the speaker, there is no need to do anything. But if you wish to access the interpretation and listen to either the French channel or the English channel, please use the interpretation box in your toolbar and select either language. You won't have to switch it during the rest of the session. You can just leave it as is. Veuillez noter que cette séance dispose d'une interprétation simultanée. Pour entendre les présentations dans la langue d'origine, ne touchez à rien. Mais pour accéder à l'interprétation, veuillez vous rendre dans la case Interprétation de votre barre d'outils et sélectionner Anglais ou Français. So with that, I will say that we will be saving all of our questions for the end. We have a few questions prepared for our panelists. And to get us launched into this really exciting discussion, I am going to introduce our moderator for today. Talia Chung is the University Librarian and Vice Provost, Knowledge Systems at the University of Ottawa. She is a CARL board member, and she also sits on the SPARC Steering Committee. Take it away, Talia.
Thanks so much, Lise. Hello, everyone. Bon après-midi, tout le monde. I'll be moderating in English to make the life of the translators a bit easier. So I'm delighted to be here with you today, and I have the honor and the privilege of living and working in Ottawa, which is located on unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe traditional territory. I'd like to take this moment to pay my deep respect to the Indigenous nations that are calling Ottawa their home, but as well Indigenous communities throughout our listening regioning. As Lise mentioned, we have a very exciting session ahead of us today. We have 4 panelists that I will introduce in a moment, and we've structured the session such that there are 5 questions, I believe, that we will be asking, and for which we'll be inviting panelists to provide comments and reflections. And I will be guarding jealously 10 minutes at the end to ensure that we are able to take your questions and your comments, because that is certainly one reason why we're gathering here today as a group. So I'd like to begin my introduction with Curtis Brundy. Curtis is the Associate University Librarian for Scholarly Communications and Collections at Iowa State University. Curtis also co-chairs the SPARC Journal Cancellation Reinvestment Working Group. And thank you, Curtis, for being here with us today. Next, I'd like to introduce Stéphanie Gagnon, who is the CEO of Libraries at the Université de Montréal. Prior to taking on this role, Stéphanie was head of collections at UDM from 2013 to 2018, where she led the important initiative New Era for Collections project, which specifically addressed the transformation of scholarly publishing at both the national and international scale. Bienvenue, Stéphanie. Next is Rebecca Graham, who is University Librarian at the University of Guelph. Rebecca's served in this role since 2012, and prior to this, she served in numerous other senior academic leadership roles, namely at Harvard University, at Johns Hopkins University, and at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Last but certainly not least is Ben Hyman, who has been the university librarian at Vancouver Island University since 2017. He has worked in government, nonprofit sector, and in public libraries, in addition to his current academic library experience. Thanks for joining us, Ben. And we were expecting a last panelist, John Cawthorne, to also be with us today, but unfortunately, circumstances and certain situation arose so that John wasn't able to join us, unfortunately. So why don't we just launch into it? As I mentioned, I'll be keeping my eye on the clock and hoping to reserve some time at the end for all of your questions and comments. But we'll begin with our questions, asking our panelists to really take a very expansive view when considering these questions, a very expansive view of your interpretation of investment in open infrastructure. And of course, this can include all sorts of infrastructure investments, whether platforms, tools, agreements, anything that would facilitate the open communication of research results. You might also want to consider investments in open content initiatives, such as library publishing programs, knowledge unlatched participation, open access agreements, really taking a broad view on this question. You might also consider mentioning both internal and external investments that your institutions make in terms of support for open infrastructure, whether they be financial investments or whether they be in-kind investments. So let's launch in. So question one, how is your institution currently investing in open infrastructure? What are your institution's primary actions to date in regards to shifting your spending towards supporting open infrastructure? And are there specific goals you are trying to achieve? I'll invite someone, whoever's ready to speak to it, to maybe put up their hand and take the floor. Stéphanie, vas-y.
Alors, je vais m'exprimer en français.
So I will be speaking French. Thank you, Talia. At the University of Montreal, our main objectives in investing in open access infrastructure are to democratize research outcomes, maximize what is published at the University of Montreal, but also to create a sustainable alternative to knowledge dissemination. It's an alternative to what the large publishers are proposing. The shift of supporting open access started a long time ago. We have an institutional repository since 2005. However, our operations for collections was a main shift 5 years ago. We looked at our different periodicals, and we noticed that only 10 to 30% of our large journals were essential to our community and were not supported in open access. So we renegotiated our large collections, and we were able to achieve some savings that were then invested elsewhere. We invested in program infrastructures and content. We invested a lot in open content. You cited knowledge unlatched and contents that is submitted to us through CRKN, and all sorts of infrastructures that try to transform scholarly publishing, such as PCI, Peer Community In. This is a review and peer review and recommendation system. Also investments in infrastructures such as OJS in 2019. And we also support Erudi with a 3-university consortium and Coalition Publica through Data Research Canada. And without wanting to exceed my time, Talia, I also want to conclude by saying that we have a joint committee with research on open access. This led to an institutional policy on open access that we launched, promoted, and implemented in January 2021, quite recently. So we are an important stakeholder in promoting open access within our institution.
Thank you, Talia. At the University of Guelph, we really look for alignment both with the university's strategic priorities and then our own commitment being represented as a key strategy for the library. We do this in order both to ensure our readiness for initiatives, either campus initiatives or more broadly provincial and national opportunities. In the library, our strategic priority is that we seek to be the hub of open initiatives in order to enhance the sharing of educational materials and research outputs. We have been growing our investments in and support of OER. We have staff who've contributed from very early on to national initiatives like Portage, now Indrio, as well as really anticipating the arrival, even though it took a long time, of the tri-agency data management policy. So we've really been staffing up for that, I would say, and I think we're well positioned for that. We teach open data tools. We use open platforms, some that Stephanie has mentioned, PKP, DSpace as our institutional repository. We engage in other provincial and national collaborations, and I think we talk a bit more about that in one of the later questions, so I'll hold some specifics there. But in looking ahead to our submission of the 2019-2020 statistics for the Canadian Association of Research Libraries, we're investing more than 5% of our overall budget on open and other infrastructures, and that's both a combination of direct support as well as the staff that we have dedicated to that work.
Very, very informative. Thank you, Rebecca. Let's go to Ben.
Great, thanks. Hello, everybody. Similar to previous speakers, the design here is to tie into our academic and institutional plan, although I wouldn't say there's necessarily a strong institutional drive to open. Speaking just within library context, we are and have, since before my time here, been active contributors and supporters of formal and informal communities and projects as part of the practice. A couple of years ago, we looked at an inclusive or holistic measurement of all of our open investments, including financial and in kind, and we were about 7%, and I expect it's probably closer to 10 now. I'd love to see that number grow. In terms of our overarching goal, it's really an objective driven by practicalities. And for us, it's a question about how can a non-ARL or CARL special purpose teaching university scale up its collections and ScholarComm supports around digital research infrastructure, research data management in an environment of relative scarcity without embracing open infrastructure. Just not sure how you get there from here. So a couple of specific things. Our ILS is open. We are part of consortia using the Evergreen Open ILS, and so is our institutional repository. And I'll probably go on and on later about our view about the importance of platforms being open as well as content.
Thank you very much, Ben. Curtis?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think what I'm going to say is going to overlap quite a bit with what everyone else is sharing. I think we're all at libraries, we're all pushing for open, so I think we're all doing some of the same things. I think what I'll say about Iowa State is that, you know, we are a signatory of OA 2020, so we have made a commitment to fully transition our traditional subscription spend towards supporting openness. We have moved out across campus a set of new journal negotiation principles, which prioritize openness, sustainability, and transparency. We've been approaching all of our journal negotiations with those goals in mind. So shooting for open access agreements, utilizing a variety of different models. You know, we're quite active in the community, working directly with university presses and societies to get them to adopt open models, and then piloting those models and trying to be there. You know, libraries have said for a long time, this is what we want. And really the ball has just started moving significantly the last 2 or 3 years. You know, we can probably chalk a lot of that up to funder mandates from, you know, groups like Plan S. But this is actually a quite exciting time for openness. I actually don't think there has been a more exciting time to be overseeing collection budgets. in libraries than it is right now, because we finally have a chance for all of these things we've been saying that we want to kind of help create what that future actually is. But we're not there yet. And so one of the things I look forward to talking about a little bit more is just the need for additional open investments and open infrastructure investments for libraries to make, because we are, checking the boxes on the things that are available. And we have a $5.5 million journal subscription budget. And I often say there are not $5.5 million of open infrastructure, open investments out there for libraries to make today. So the work that needs to be done for us to transition these large collection budgets over to supporting openness, there is a lot that needs to be done with that. And again, I think we're making a lot of progress. And the last thing I'll just mention for folks who don't know anything about Iowa State, we're a little bit unique in the United States. There are public land grant universities, and Iowa State is one of them. And it's in our mission statement that not only should we be creating knowledge and applying that knowledge, but we should be sharing that knowledge with Iowa and the rest of the world. And we take that to heart with the work that we're doing and trying to transition over to supporting open investments rather than just paywalled content all of us have been paying for so many years.
That's great. Thank you so much, Curtis, for also situating those of us who aren't based in the U.S. the context about around land grant institutions. And it's clear with the first round of responses how institutional context plays an essential role in the ways in which our university libraries respond to this larger issue. And yet, clearly, the university libraries play a key role as a hub. I forget exactly who said that, the hub on campus for open infrastructure, open investments. Thank you for that first round. So moving right along to our second question. Could you please discuss how you use values, rubrics, and/or data to develop priorities and guide your institution's investment decisions? So who would like to respond to that first? Stéphanie.
Merci, Talia.
Thank you, Talia. We use different management data in our analytics of different collections and journals. We look at citation and usage data. We also look at the availability of content and open access for different journals. It's with all of this interrelated data that we negotiate our budgets, and we established a principle of a fair price when we deal with different providers. This principle has also been set with investment guidelines within open access content. We've established criteria and parameters because there's such an overwhelming offer, and we use these guidelines to help us in our decision-making process. In your questions, you asked us to reflect on how we ask providers, or how we ask providers to respect our own principles. So I might digress here, but by looking at the university's policies, we wrote to the main publishers that our researcher community would now be subject to this policy, and they would have to respect certain guidelines. And we invited publishers to make sure that there was consistency, and this would be the new way to proceed. Finally, we launched a monograph publishing support program with online access, so with university presses. We asked them metrics and indicators. We asked to provide data on the impact of this program on their activities, on the visibility of open access publications, on the dissemination, and on sales, to better understand, measure, and fine-tune programs in the future. Very interesting. Thank you, Stephanie.
Is there someone else who would like to provide some reflections on this question? Curtis, and then Ben.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, we're definitely coming at this in a much different way, these investments, than we did, just thinking about, the world that we're trying to leave, the subscription world. So certainly when we're approaching negotiations, we're taking a whole new approach with our data modeling and the way that we're looking at what we need to know in order to have informed open access negotiations. I already mentioned our journal negotiation principles. That's informing our values. We send those out to publishers, in the lead up to negotiations. And then I think I'd like to mention here the work that SPARC is doing with, SPARC has both the journal negotiations community of practice that is up and running, and then the reinvestment working group that I co-chair with Kathleen De Laurenti at Johns Hopkins. This group is getting at some of this as well, because I think that we can have our institutional values and our institutional principles, but these are also things where there are a lot of shared values across the community. And I think the work of like the reinvestment group that we're involved with, I think that is where groups like SPARC come in. That's where groups like OA 2020 come in, and our library consortia. Although we're so fragmented in the US, I don't feel like we do the best of jobs in the US leveraging the power of our consortia. And I know we're going to get into that a little bit later. But I did just want to say is in terms of the working group around reinvestments that SPARC is leading, that work is quite needed. And I think that SPARC is very open to feedback from libraries that are trying to set forth these sorts of values, trying to move forward principles, trying to establish, stakeholder buy-in. I think that's the type of feedback that we're looking for from the community to try and inform the work that group is doing around these very important issues.
Thank you, Curtis. Ben?
Thanks. My comments are abbreviated now because of all the excellent contributions of the others, but I'll say just in terms of rubric, an approach that we've taken recently, thanks to the great work of faculty here, has been to develop a pledge to users. And it really situates our work and our ongoing commitment, and I think also sets a bit of a bar that we're still working towards. It's on a continuum, but a couple of examples from this. One, we commit to centering you, your needs, interests, and challenges in our planning and operational work. So that's a pledge to our community. And another, we commit to ensuring our spaces, collections, and services are accessible to you to the greatest extent possible. So again, just that really overarching lens. And so suddenly where the option exists to select open with equivalent or roughly equivalent coverage or functionality, whether it's platform or content, again, to Curtis's point, where there is an option to select open, suddenly many other options tend to look a lot less compelling, and particularly in context of market consolidation.
Thank you so much, Ben. If there aren't any other responses to this question, we'll move along to the next. And I think what particularly struck me as you were making your comments is certainly the rubrics and the data-driven approach, but so much of it is fundamentally values-driven as well. And bringing those elements together as a community, how much we can actually accomplish. So thank you for that. We'll move next to our question 3. Can you each speak to how important to your institutions are collective and consortial investments within this open infrastructure, open investment context? Let's start with Rebecca.
Thanks, Talia. And I appreciate your sort of underscoring the shared values, which I think is really what many of us look to in our consortial engagements and the investments that are made. I would say for us at Guelph, they're essential. I see them as enabling us leveraging our own resources in a far more effective, but also effective ways, but also where we're able to enhance development beyond a scale that we could do independently. They represent contributions to sustainability as well, which I think is increasingly important in this day and age. I would say these decisions for us and these engagements for us influence and inform the choices that we make increasingly. It's really the value for our money as much as anything, and the commitment that we're making to our users. So I really appreciated the pledge that Ben talked about. That seems quite wise, and I hope well received. It allows us to scale our capacity and our ability to innovate in a far more robust way than we could on our own. And I think I would like to at least give a shout out to the most recent round of negotiations that the Content Strategy Committee for CRKN took up for us. It was very much principles based and with a focus on transformative agreements. And we certainly saw with a couple of the big negotiations that happened over this past year that we were able to deliver on those. So kudos to the folks involved in that.
Thank you, Rebecca. Is there someone else who might? Stéphanie?
Je vais me permettre peut-être être répété en français ou enfin certains éléments seulement. C'est évidemment un levier de
In
négociation.
French, obviously, this is a good negotiation lever that allows us to reduce prices and to establish collective negotiation strategies by being different stakeholders to reaffirm this and to advocate for open access. At UDM, we withdrew from some negotiation efforts and we relied on the fair price, a concept that we developed. But things have developed since then, and we are now joining in negotiations that focus on a progression towards open access, open content, and more interesting prices, but also in selecting resources that are proposed as some initiatives that allow us to support collectively what would be harder to do independently. So supporting different initiatives for infrastructure, services, and content. So that's about it. Thank you, Stephanie.
For a non-ARL or CARL school, the role of consortia and consortial investments are absolutely critical. We'd be dead in the water without that. When I think about infrastructure in particular, and it's particularly critical as we scale up services and supports Canadian context for tri-agency policy, RDM policy, and digital humanities growth areas, for example. And I think in terms of an engaged consortial approach and engaged communities of practice are going to be at least as important as values longer term for how consortia operate. And when I think about some dominant trends in terms of healthy indicators for open software communities and how applicable those can be to any kind of community. And so, for example, active contributions to documentation, commitments to code base development sprints, shared and contributed staffing. These are all considered healthy and I think a struggle for many library consortia that have many years of history. These are new dynamics. It's not the way that business was conducted previously. And so this is, I think, absolutely critical consideration for long-term success, both for the health of consortia, but health for libraries working together around open communities and developing the informal and formal ways that we can continue to work together.
That's very interesting, Ben. Thank you for that future-oriented intervention. Curtis?
Yeah, I would echo what everyone has said. I think if we want to move quickly, if we want to scale, if we want to provide, a counterweight to, the gigantic commercial interests that work in these spaces, libraries working together through our consortia is the way that we're going to do that. And I will, not to pick on the library consortia in the United States, but I feel like we have a long way to go. We talk about reorienting our libraries toward openness and open investments, but our library consortia in the US have not made that transition either. And so many of our consortia in the US function is buying clubs, and what they're well-versed at buying are subscriptions and traditional closed content. So we have a tremendous amount of work to do. And just as one example of this, I did a back of the envelope calculation, before I jumped on the call. I went to Lyrasis' site. Lyrasis has an open program, and this is not to pick on Lyrasis. I think actually Lyrasis is doing the best out of all the U.S. consortia, if you leave out like the CDL. But what Lyrasis has is open programs, and I think we participate from Iowa State in all of them. And if we do our maximum investment across every one of those, it comes out to about $100,000. That's what we can invest through Lyrasis, who's doing about the best job in the U.S. We spend more than that just on Scopus. So that's how much work we have to do through the consortia to figure out how libraries can find channels for these types of open investments. So we definitely, very important, but tremendous amount of work for all of us to do to take back to our library consortiums and work with them to make this all happen.
Yeah, very, very interesting comments, Curtis. Thank you for that. So almost a desire for us to look forward and perhaps as a community be a little bit more ambitious collectively when we talk about what should be within the scope of open infrastructure and open investments. Thank you for that. Moving along to question 4. Can you talk a little bit about what changes your library has had to make, if any, in terms of internal functioning in order to increase spending on open infrastructure? So this might include restructuring your internal budget, re-examining your organizational structure within the library, or putting into place specific policies that are library or institution-wide. I think we've heard Stephanie talk a little bit about the open access policy that's recently been adopted at UDM. Maybe if I can invite you to share some of your reflections, that would be terrific. Who would like to go first? Stephanie?
Yes, we have implemented our institutional policy that enabled libraries to implement the large principles. Each researcher has to file or deposit their work in the Papyrus institutional repository. So this restructured our work flows. This meant an increase in research activity. And this also corresponded to the implementation of OJS. And this involved new activities for teams with new infrastructure or with new broad principles to implement. In our institution, we also shifted the focus of our activities. Traditionally, activities were done in the unit that managed research and teaching services. Now, the management of open access articles is done with the catalog team and metadata teams. These are the data specialists, after all, and they provide frontline services, whereas the disciplinary librarians provide second line services. This was an interesting reorganization that focused on specific skills, and the system works relatively well. And in terms of investments, I'm a bit timid in sharing with you the investments in open access. You provided large percentages, but for collections, we invest 1% of our acquisition budget, but we'd like to maximize this with our target of 2.5%, taking into consideration our capacity. All right, thank you, Stephanie.
Share thoughts.
I can jump in. Sorry, I was trying to raise my hand and I couldn't find my button. Yeah, I would just say, I've thought a lot in terms of what libraries need to do with the collection operation in order to shift it. And we've already highlighted values, right? This just keeps coming up over and over and over again. And I think when we're talking about a 1%, a 2.5%, a 5%, a 17%, investment of collection spending and openness, when we are saying openness is our value, right? We're not being ambitious enough. What we want is 100% investment. And how do we get that? And I thought in terms of like, is it having the right staff? Do we actually need to slot our scholarly communications librarians over underneath, the collections program? Maybe. It depends on your library. But I think the more important point is articulating what these values are, and then just integrating that into your collection day-to-day work. And if you do that, I think all of a sudden you will be looking, through a new set of glasses at these opportunities in front of us. And I know that for some libraries in the US, larger libraries, these collection budgets are wildly complicated. They're distributed across who knows how many people across how many different disciplines. So you have to actually bring together quite a coalition in order to do this. So I'm not saying that this is easy to do, but this is what's necessary. This is the conversation that needs to be taking place within our collection groups, within our libraries, I feel. Define the values, adopt the values, bring those values to the table every time you talk to a publisher, I'd say.
Thank you, Curtis. Ben?
I think challenges within the organization, less so within the library, but in terms of working across with colleagues in other areas within the academy and on the other side of the house, so to speak. So not to pick on those colleagues in other areas, but really pervasive market-fueled fear, uncertainty, and doubt about and antiquated perceptions about the role of open at enterprise scale is a really dark cloud still over all things open. And right alongside that, in the last few years, sort of the hegemony of discussions about open educational resources. And OER is certainly a component of open, but it's not what we're talking about very frequently in terms of content in a library context. And so I think the change I've observed is that we have needed to become much more outspoken internally within the institution and working across. At a high level, the pledge I mentioned earlier has certainly been helpful. We were also somewhat explicit in our most recent strategic plan that did the full run through bicameral approval and so forth. And at the end of the day, I mean, it's the same talking points I've fallen back to for probably too long, but this notion that open is insurance against the really volatile marketplace. And hysterically in a 20-whatever-year career in libraries, there's never been a time that we haven't had a volatile marketplace. So those talking points have been very handy, and I think they'll continue to be. But if we continue to see consolidation quicken at the pace that it is quickening, there needs to be an alternative. And we do need to back that with at least as much enthusiasm as we back commercial providers and platforms.
Thank you for that, Ben. If there are no other comments in response to this question, I think what strikes me is the sense of urgency that I'm hearing behind all of your comments, and certainly some let's say awareness building or advocacy that still needs to occur, not just on our campuses, but equally within our own university library organizations. So I appreciate that. Thank you. I think Ben's comments are particularly helpful as we segue to the last question, which is quite an open-ended question. And what I'd invite you all to provide in terms of comments and reflections is, what in all of this work do you find most challenging? So let's go to Rebecca first.
Thanks, Talia. As a person who often suffers from a tendency towards the literal, what I've really struggled with and what I have found challenging is if you're not on a campus where there is a sort of an understanding, much less an embrace, how do you take up this work in a way that's effective? And so in thinking back to the first question about, what are the goals or the things that sort of primary actions, I talked about looking for alignment with the university's strategic priorities. And so for us, there are 3 of those of the 5 that I think are really key. And so those are connecting community and knowledge sharing. We've seen some other references to that, catalyzing discovery and change, and stewarding valued resources. And so I think for us, it's really about how do we engage the campus around those priorities and put forward how we can help to either lead and or support. I think, the pandemic is such an interesting time. So one of the other things I was thinking about in terms of challenging is timing is challenging. So the pandemic really underscored for all of us the importance of open educational resources. We all struggled with the challenge around licensing textbooks, which were really critical. But at the same time, faculty were already sort of flat out as a result of that need to pivot to new ways of teaching. But I can say I had a meeting with colleagues who are supporting our open and accessible course content task force this morning. I can say that we see some encouragement coming out of this looking ahead to new normal post-pandemic with an increased interest in OER, and not just traditional OER, but OER sort of spanning a broader variety, both from colleges on our campus, as well as form. And so I take some encouragement from that, and we will continue to build on that, I think. Thanks, Talia.
Thank you, Rebecca. Stéphanie?
Oui, de notre côté.
Yes, in our case, I believe that the alignment with the community is rather good. We are implementing our policy, and we hope that time will allow people to better understand. It's a new era for collections, and now with our policy, we were able to share, raise awareness. We will conduct a second consultation this year as well. So we will be able to have new discussions and sow new seeds on open access. We have linguistic also issues and challenges. If we look for French content, if we look to support French initiatives, there are not that many. So we have Erudit, which is somewhat of our flagship, but also seeing if we want to invest 1%, 2%, 5%, we need an open access offer available that we can support. That's a challenge for us. Otherwise, I would say that the structure of open access content is growing. It's very broad, and sustainability is not ensured. We feel that we are always managing risk, that we are supporting initiatives and pilot projects. We are pleased to do this, but on the other hand, we have Elsevier that has strong foundations and funds that are completely separate from these initiatives. So we don't always have our guarantees, but we're still pleased to support this. But we have to acknowledge that there's more risk in this context. As for communications, we think we have strong staff buy-in. Faculty understood this during the context. Faculty understood how we had to shift quickly when printed collections were no longer available, and librarians looked towards open access content, and we have work from OERs on our side. So there's a slow transformation. So pace is a challenge, but I think we will achieve our objectives.
Yeah, thank you. I will start out by saying that I am a total optimist, and I think we're making terrific progress. And now I'm going to lay out a bunch of negatives and challenges I think that are faced in the community. So we already talked about a lack of open investment. So even if you are a library that's gotten stakeholder buy-in, faculty wants to do it, librarians want to do it, investments aren't necessarily there. The problem of APCs is just gigantic. It is the path of least resistance. They're inequitable. Cost control is going to be a burden. Not a burden, I mean, it's going to be impossible. So we've got to come up with inventive open models that we can get societies, university presses. And I think we're making progress there, but there's a tremendous amount of work to be done. I think that opinions of colleagues and some of the heated rhetoric, sometimes that can be a challenge. You know, I feel like we're trying to push this rock up the hill, and sometimes we're our own worst enemies and we're pretty hard on one another. I think that it's a little bit, some of the way that we talk about things, I think could be improved. You know, like this is a panel about open infrastructure, and yet we defined it so broadly. Obviously, we're not just talking about infrastructure, we're talking about open investments writ whole. And sometimes I feel like we just focus in on talking about open infrastructure. And for some people, that's platforms, technology, and something. And then we end up talking past one another, and that's not helpful. And then the last thing I would just say is the ongoing challenge of a research assessment culture that continues to make or break careers based on what journal you get published in. So working with Dora and trying to reform the way research assessment is done, it's just an ongoing challenge for all of us. Pretty bleak, but mostly I'm positive.
I appreciate your optimistic general predisposition. I think it's needed in this work. And I would say probably many of us share that with you, but realistically facing the challenges. I don't know if there are any other comments in response to this question. If not, oh, Ben, okay, go ahead, please.
Or not, if you're pressed for time. Just to amplify everything the other panelists said, I think the divergent perspectives really is, I'm not typically optimistic, but I'd say it's the piece I look to that does give me some optimism is because that exists within academic culture, because of increasing market consolidation or continuing, it could build some bridges that haven't existed working across VPs of research, for example, with traditional library portfolios and others, so that we start to see the common cause. So the shared sort of existential threat as being my great source of optimism, which I understand is ridiculous, but I look forward to it.
Thank you so much, Ben, for wrapping that up. So certainly, you know, what I heard was concern around the fragility of some of the investments that we're making, the progress that we as a community have made, and that the need for institutional alignment continues to be essential. I thought it was particularly interesting the point that Curtis raised with respect to the way in which we talk about open infrastructure, and how very often these streams of activities, these streams of discussion merge and perhaps erase some of the conversations that we need to be having in a more concerted or more mature way. I thought that was particularly interesting, Curtis, and I think that's something that certainly I will take away from this panel discussion. So we have a good, healthy 10 minutes to take questions from participants. I'm looking to these. I don't know if the questions will come in through the chat or if we have a Q&A mode in this meeting.
Yes, I don't know if you can see on the bottom, there should be Q&A, and we do have 3 questions already.
Okay, so why don't we start in order of entry? Mika Vandegrift, I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly, asks for the panelists to comment on if we can start to separate discussions about OA initiatives collections from open infrastructure. Are there infrastructures to invest in that are not solely about open access to scholarly literature? Is there anyone who'd like to share some thoughts on that question? Curtis?
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, that's the point that I just left off on, and I think it's a great one. And one thing I will say about that is we do separate those conversations out. If we're talking about investing in open access, open content versus purely, you know, open infrastructure is more like technology and platforms. Not all of those investments necessarily would need to come out of the library collection budget. Like, I feel like we have not a mandate, but we have had a conversation on campus about redirecting subscription spending to support, you know, open publication. If it is a piece of open infrastructure that is, you know, really not connected to that at all, you know, that's a different conversation we would need to have on campus about whether or not that's appropriate spending. It's one I would be happy to have, but it would be a conversation that would be needed.
Thank you, Curtis. Any other thoughts from other panelists? In that case, let's go to Dana's question next. Reflecting on Mika's question, can panelists comment on how we can plan for long-term stewardship of investment in open access without also investing in security and sustainability through open infrastructure? I'm not sure the question is clear to me. I don't know, Dana, if you're in a position to speak to your question. Sometimes internet connections don't permit. Ben, please go ahead.
I'm going to, because Dana is a colleague, so I'm going to pretend that we're mind melded here, but I think where she's going, and I'll take a stab at it, is part of the fear, uncertainty, and doubt I talked about earlier that's prevalent in kind of open response, market-driven response. A weakness, perhaps, as we grow open infrastructure within our community is that, are we attending to all of these important dimensions of a healthy open community? And so I see here that on the one hand, we have a sense that we should separate open collections from open infrastructure. And on the other hand, there's some necessity to bring these things together into a holistic frame because collections and platform do need to coexist. They're not mutually exclusive to a certain extent. And I think, again, as a small school, those silos don't actually exist. So faculty here work across School-Com collections systems. I think that gets more challenging as you scale up. But again, from a small school perspective, indeed, some of our shift to open would not come from collections going forward. It will come from other dimensions of budget. And so I think it may actually be preferable to draw as broadly as possible to meet the challenge. And then to the question of security and sustainability specifically, again, in a Canadian context, libraries aren't renowned for sticking to open platforms or perhaps sticking to them at a certain level of buy-in in perpetuity. This is a challenge for the community. It's a historic challenge. I don't see it going away. And I think security would add an additional cost. So considerations of privacy, access, identity management, all of those notions are very much market driven at the moment in terms of infrastructure at scale. So hopefully I haven't killed Dana's question with my response.
Thank you for that, Ben. Rebecca.
Sort of building on what Ben has said, just in the context of Guelph, is I do think we've had to navigate a tension over time that has lessened as well as more parts of our organization have taken up this work. And so we have a committee that works across both collections and research and scholarship, where we have a lot of dedicated staff supporting open activities. But it's also very much, I would say, woven through systems considerations. So we're looking at a new system for our archival and special collections group that will focus on how we can adopt open solutions. And I think even when we sort of move up to provincial or national level, we're very much focused on how do we sort of weave our needs into the solutions that are being developed and or deployed at the provincial or national level. So I'd like to think it's not an either or, but it's a both and, as it were.
Thanks, Rebecca. So I'm going to go back to the question board, and Leonora Crema, again, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Leonora, upvoted question 3 times. Wonderful work you're all doing. Can any of you share specific approaches you've taken or successes you've had overcoming the reputational status appeal of commercial journals? Dora, for instance, does not seem to be catching fire in most North American institutions. Is there someone who'd like to respond to that? Curtis.
Yeah, I can share a couple of thoughts. We have taken steps. I wouldn't say that we have had successes. So we started with Dora at our library. We actually moved it out through different governance groups, had conversations in the library about what Dora is, and ultimately we signed on to Dora. We're also one of the only library financial supporters of Dora because we think the work is absolutely essential. So any of you looking for an open investment, I'd say get in touch with Anna Hatch at Dora and let's scale up Dora, because I think it is our best thing we have going in this space. Other things we have done in this is, outreach to our VPR office. So we had a associate VPR who he and I actually attended a Dora meeting at HHMI about 1.5 years ago. And unfortunately, the pandemic hit, he retired. And so some of that momentum we had in that partnership has fizzled, and we have to pick it back up. But that's the work that has to be done. And I just think this is a tough one to lead from the library. You've got to have the department chairs, you've got to have faculty senate folks, you've got to have your VPR folks helping out with this one, because it's not necessarily one that the library needs to lead, but we can sure as heck initiate the conversation.
Great points, Curtis. Thank you. There are other comments that you would like to share among the panelists? All right. I notice we're at 12:57. I'm looking to Lise in case we need to maybe consider wrapping up, and whether there are housekeeping remarks that we need to end the meeting with.
Well, I would say we should probably wrap it up quickly, quite soon. There are a couple of questions still in there. But certainly we've covered a lot of territory. So I would say we should definitely thank our excellent moderator and panelists. And I'd also like to thank CRKN and SPARC for collaborating on this with us. I hope we continue to have similar conversations. And I certainly look forward to those. And thank you all for your questions as well.
Great to be here with you all today. Thank you so much, panelists.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Merci.
Thank you.